a lifeless body beneath the old clock tower, and time itself seems guilty. Welcome to Mystery Parlour. I am your host, Axon. Tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? Your comments bring these mysteries to life. Let's dive in. Market Square, Flaxborough, 10:47 a.m., a Tuesday that had begun with no intention of distinction. The weekly market bustled in its familiar, half-hearted way. Cabbages of heroic size arranged in military precision, trays of buns resembling naval biscuits, and a row of hens that regarded prospective buyers with the same faint disgust as the mayor regarded the ratepayers. At the square's centre, the town clock tower, that lofty custodian of punctual mediocrity, had recently been restored, its face repainted and its bell coaxed into obedience after years of erratic striking. The clock had been unveiled just the previous week, an event of such consequence that the Flaxborough Citizen had devoted nearly 2 columns to the mayor's speech, including his apology for the unexpected tolling during the luncheon interval. Now, with the tradesmen calling, the women comparing lettuces, and the bus from Fenstone expelling its latest cargo of gossip, the tower resumed its benign reign over Flaxborough life. No one, not even Mrs. Violet Teal, whose memory of municipal events was as vivid as her collection of artificial chrysanthemums, suspected that the clock tower was to be the scene of anything out of the ordinary. That was until a scream, brief, indignant, and oddly domestic in tone, echoed through the square. It came from Miss Gertrude Fanshawe, who had been admiring the clock's new brass plaque commemorating the Flaxborough Civic Beautification Committee, 1957-1974. Miss Fanshawe was a tall, angular woman of a moral rigidity that had long discouraged companionship. She now stood frozen, her umbrella extended towards the narrow door at the tower's base. Inside the arched entrance, lying half-submerged in a shallow puddle of rainwater and civic neglect, was a man's body. By the time Sergeant Love arrived, having abandoned both a meat pie and his composure, the scene had already acquired the distinct flavor of Flaxborough crisis management. Mr. Clegg, the newsagent, had taken charge of the crowd by shouting contradictory instructions. Mrs. Teal was offering to fetch a shawl for the poor departed soul, and the mayor himself, Alderman Mowbray, had appeared in his chain of office, possibly in case the deceased required official representation. "Best stand back, ladies and gents," Sergeant Love said, with the air of a man who wished the ladies and gents would stand forward to block his own view. He peered into the tower entrance, grimacing. "Looks like he's been here a bit." "Who is he?" called Mrs. Teal, whose interest in the dead was never impaired by delicacy. "Don't rightly know yet," said Love. "We'd best wait for Inspector Purbright." There was a general murmur, half respect and half anticipation. For in Flaxborough, Inspector Purbright was a man of quiet fame, a figure who, like the town's library, was simultaneously admired and feared, depending on one's reading habits. When Purbright arrived, it was with his usual unhurried composure, the kind that suggested not so much calm as a deliberate refusal to let the world impose its tempo upon him. He was accompanied by a faint smell of pipe tobacco and the impression that he had already thought through the next 3 steps of the morning. He nodded politely to the crowd, as though acknowledging them at a garden party. "Good morning, all." "Sergeant Love," he said mildly. "I believe you mentioned a body." "Yes, sir. Just inside the tower. Fellow's been dead some hours, I'd say." Purbright stooped to enter the doorway. The interior was dim and smelled of stone, damp, and the distant, self-conscious ticking of municipal machinery. The body lay awkwardly on its side, coat askew, one hand resting against the wall as if to steady himself during some moment of surprise. His face, a pale, undistinguished one, bore no mark of violence, only a faint, puzzled expression as though death had been an interruption rather than an assault. Said Purbright quietly. "Unlikely he came here for the view." He turned, surveying the base of the tower. A few puddles, a fallen glove, a small rectangle of paper half melded to the wet floor. "Sergeant," he said, "that note by his foot. Gently, if you please." Love retrieved it with care, flattening it out. "Flaxborough Horological Society, annual subscription due." "That's all, sir." Purbright smiled faintly. Perhaps time finally caught up with him. The sergeant looked uncertain whether that was a joke or a clue. By noon, the square had surrendered the scene to the constables and resumed its daily commerce, though with a new layer of conversational enrichment. In the Red Lion, a theory had already emerged that the dead man was a foreign spy. In Pratt's Chemist, he was said to be a debt collector from the gas board. And in Miss Puckle's Millinery, he was confidently identified as a London art critic who had once ordered a trilby by telephone. None of these accounts improved with repetition, but each gained authority through the speaker's insistence that she had it on very good authority. At the police station, meanwhile, Purbright was reading the preliminary report by the police surgeon, Dr. Hilliard, a man who regarded death with professional gratitude. Heart failure, likely induced by shock, Hilliard had written, but what caused the shock is another matter. No bruising, no evidence of struggle, clothing wet but intact, no wallet or papers. Purbright closed the file and looked out the window toward the distant clock tower, which now resumed its innocent chime over the market stalls. That afternoon, in the mayor's parlour, Alderman Mowbray convened an impromptu civic emergency discussion. Present were himself, Councillor Cripps, chairman of the Public Works Committee, and Mrs. Teal, who had not been invited but arrived on behalf of the moral conscience of the town. "It's a most distressing business," Mowbray declared, tugging at his chain, "particularly in view of the recent restoration. Bad for public confidence." "Not to mention the clock's reputation," murmured Mrs. Teal darkly. "That tower has always had an air of foreboding." Purbright, who had been summoned on the pretext of giving reassurance, listened with polite detachment. He rarely interrupted civic conversations. He found they tended to reach absurdity without his help. When the councillors had exhausted their concern for Flaxborough's image, he rose. "Gentlemen, madam," he said pleasantly, "I'll see what I can do to restore both confidence and punctuality. In the meantime, perhaps best not to make public statements." Mrs. Teal drew herself up. "Inspector, I shall pray for justice." "Thank you, Mrs. Teal," Purbright said. "That will save us both some time." Outside, as he lit his pipe, the inspector paused by the square. The clock tower loomed benignly against the fading afternoon, its hands pointing with unwitting irony to 4:45. The same hour, according to Dr. Hilliard, when the deceased had likely died. Purbright watched a pair of pigeons settle on the parapet and smiled faintly. "Time," he murmured, "has a most uncharitable sense of humour." The market did not so much settle after the discovery as rearrange itself into new lines of communication. By late afternoon, the square had taken on the brittle poise of a parlour where someone has knocked over a vase and the household, while continuing with tea, cannot help glancing at the damp patch on the carpet. Miss Puckle informed her millinery customers that the deceased had been of a delicate constitution and probably foreign, a judgment built on nothing more than the shade of his trousers. Mr. Clegg, discovering that a crowd buys more newspapers than a queue, stationed himself by the bus stop and composed headlines aloud for no edition in particular. In the Red Lion, a rumour, blown like froth over a pint, hardened into statement. The dead man had been seen with the mayor on the previous Friday, discussing the clock. Purbright let the talk run. His presence in such places tended, like a stethoscope, to make people breathe differently. He preferred them conversationally unbuttoned. He walked without hurry along the high street, where damp stone carried the smell of onions and boot polish, and stopped outside Pratt's Chemist. Through the glass, in a display of tonics, a card announced For nervous palpitations, try Hartwell's drops. Inside, Mr. Pratt received him with the solemn relish of a man about to contribute to important proceedings while remaining indispensable to the provision of lint. "You will have heard, Mr. Pratt," said Purbright, "that a gentleman died unexpectedly in the Clocktower today." "I have been apprised," Pratt said as though by telegram from the Admiralty. "A sad business, Inspector. We cannot have our civic improvements turning mortuary. Do you recall, within the last fortnight, selling any of Hartwell's drops to a man unaccustomed to them?" Pratt folded his hands. "Hartwell's is popular with the over-improved. However, there was a purchaser yesterday, lank fellow, uneasily shaved. A stranger. He paid in small coins and asked the way to the market square." "Did he give a name?" "Only an apology for not giving one. I recognized in it a London accent, or perhaps the tertiary education equivalent." "Thank you," said Purbright. "If the apology returns for more drops, do let us know." When he left, Sergeant Love was waiting across the street with information gathered in a manner combining diligence with the capacity to be confided in by barmaids. "Sir, landlord at the Red Lion says the dead man took a half of bitter last night and asked about the clock restoration. Wanted to know where the funds came from and who held the keys to the tower." Purbright's expression did not alter, though his gaze made a small, thoughtful journey to the gutters where yesterday's confetti of paint flakes still glinted. Did anyone oblige him with answers? The mayor was dining in the lounge. There was a nod exchanged, but no conversation, so the landlord swears on his license. "A noble oath," murmured Purbright. "And the keys?" "Public Works keeps them in Councillor Cripp's drawer, plus a spare with the sexton, on account of pigeons finding doctrine persuasive." "Did our man acquire one?" "Landlord couldn't say. He did notice the stranger had a notebook. Very tidy writing." Love hesitated. "The book's not on him now." "Ah," said Purbright, as if reminded of an appointment. He turned toward the square where the clock chimed 6 with an air of having nothing to reproach itself for. "We must ask Councillor Cripps to show us his drawer." Cripps, roused from his place at the dining table, where a greasy copy of the Flaxborough Citizen protected the cloth from his stew, received them with the bravery of a man who suspects a form is about to be filled in. His house smelt of furniture polish and a determination not to be accused of extravagance. At Purbright's gentle request, he fetched a ring with 3 keys from a drawer, containing string, invoices, and a packet of biscuits whose loyalty to their original crispness had lapsed. 3, Purbright said. "You told the committee there were 4. "Ah," said Cripps, producing a frown like a truant syllabus. "The 4th was on loan to Mr. Wilkie, the horologist. He oversaw the pendulum adjustments. He keeps it tidy, you know, the clock. A decent man." "Where is Mr. Wilkie this evening?" Cripps consulted an almanac for reassurance. "At home, I should say, or his wife would have told me otherwise at choir. He lives off Colebrook Lane. Any trouble with the clock, Inspector?" "Only its new punctuality," said Purbright. "It seems to be keeping excellent time with events." They found Mr. Wilkie in a workshop behind his cottage, a trench of lamplight spilling from the door, where clock faces leaned against the wall like portraits turned to the plaster during a family quarrel. He was small, grey, and very clean, the kind of man who made dust behave. "Inspector," he said, removing a loop as though it were a private eye of his own, "I heard the news. Shocking. The Tower, of all places." "You have a key to it, Mr. Wilkie." Wilkie nodded and produced it, shining from a tin marked "Nails." Verified. "I took it yesterday to check the escape wheel. Returned it first thing to Cripp's clerk. Signed the book." "We shall admire your penmanship presently," said Purbright. "Did you meet anyone at the Tower?" "A fellow loitering by the plaque. Asked if I knew what the restoration had cost. I referred him to the Citizen. Figures were printed. He smiled in a manner that didn't reach his eyes and said newspapers sometimes omitted the most interesting sums." "And last night?" "Home," said Wilkie, with the defensiveness of the blameless. "I had my porridge, mended a regulator, and went to bed at 10, like any decent metronome." As they walked back toward the square, Love ventured, "Sir, if the man asked about money, maybe he was a journalist." "Possible," Purbright said. "Though journalists tend to ask questions as if they already have the answers, whereas our friend was acquiring them like stamps." "Debt collector, then?" "Collectors usually know to whom they are collecting." He asked for directions to the square at Pratt's. "Blackmailer," Love offered, with the air of someone guessing the weight of a pudding. "Blackmailers prefer enclosed premises," said Purbright. "The Clocktower, being largely hollow, lacks counselling facilities." They paused beneath the tower door, now taped and official. Purbright looked up at the dial, pale in the lamplight, then down at the stone threshold, where a faint scuff of dried mud had refused the cleaner's zeal. "Sergeant, there is a small absence troubling me." "Sir?" "The note about the Horological Society's subscription. Our man had it, but not the notebook he was seen using. Someone tidied away the one thing with his handwriting in it." "Who'd do that?" "The tidy," said Purbright, "and those in a hurry to become so." He turned his head slightly, as if listening for a sound only towns make when thinking. "Tomorrow we shall discover who holds subscriptions and who refuses to." Love looked puzzled. "Subscriptions to clocks, sir." "To pride," said Purbright, and smiled. The next morning found Flaxborough briefly subdued, as though the town itself were rehearsing contrition. The market stall stood empty under a damp sky. Pigeons, less troubled by mortality, clattered along the roof of the clock tower. Inside the police station, Inspector Purbright was already at his desk, studying a list written in his own tidy hand. Flaxborough Horological Society. Members in good standing. It had been extracted from the Society's records, which Miss Fanshawe, the secretary, had surrendered with the relish of one who regards both civic service and faint scandal as twin duties. The Society, it appeared, consisted of 7 members: Alderman Mowbray, Councillor Cripps, Mr. Wilkie the clockmaker, Miss Fanshawe herself, and 3 others: a retired schoolmaster named Huttle, a draper called Mr. Felix Dodd, and a solicitor, Mr. Selby of Selby and Bright. A thin quorum of respectability, Purbright thought, though the combination of politics, mechanism, and legal advice seldom produced pure harmony. Sergeant Love entered, holding a damp envelope. "Post just come in, sir, addressed to the station but marked, 'For police attention, urgent.'" Purbright took it, slit it open with a penknife he used for both letters and boiled sweets, and drew out a single sheet. The handwriting was careful, but agitated. "Inspector, you are looking in the wrong place." The man in the tower had papers that could have ruined 2 good names. He was not from London. He was sent for. "Please don't ask how I know." "A friend to the town." Purbright studied the words a long moment, then folded the letter neatly. "Sergeant," he said, "there's a curious variety of civic loyalty. Some preserve flower beds, others preserve secrets." Love frowned. "Anonymous, sir? Might be a prank." "Quite. But the prankster knows our visitor carried papers. That detail has not yet enjoyed publication. Could be someone at the scene, or someone whose sleep was interrupted by conscience." Purbright rose and reached for his coat. "Fetch the car, Love. We shall call upon Mr. Huttle. Retired schoolmasters often keep unretired minds." Huttle's house was a square of brick surrounded by a garden more theoretical than maintained. The man himself opened the door in a dressing gown patterned with compass roses and ink blots. His eyes were bright and a little alarmed, as though education had been a lifelong surprise. "Inspector Purbright," he said, blinking behind spectacles. "To what do I owe—" "No, don't tell me. You've come about the Clocktower affair. Everyone's been whispering that you would." "Then Flaxborough is well informed," Purbright said mildly. "May we come in?" The sitting room smelled faintly of damp chalk. A half-assembled clock lay on the table beside a tray of tea things. Huttle gestured them to chairs. Dreadful business. I saw the fellow once, you know, at the last horological meeting. Came as a guest, I was told, though nobody said invited by whom. Would you describe him? Tallish, pale, a nervous habit of smoothing his sleeve. Spoke very little. The mayor was making a speech about time as a metaphor of civic progress, a notion of some elasticity, and the stranger kept glancing at the committee papers. I assumed he was a journalist. Did he seem to know anyone? Huttle hesitated. Perhaps Mr. Dodd. Our draper has a manner suggesting acquaintance with everyone's wallet. They exchanged a few words before the meeting began. Purbright leaned back. Would you recall what Mr. Dodd said? I believe he said, "You're wasting your journey. It's all tied up neatly now." The other man smiled, though not in agreement. Outside again, the inspector paused at the gate. "Sergeant, let us pay our respects to Mr. Dodd's notion of neatness." Dodd's drapery shop occupied a corner of the high street, its window displaying shirts so precisely folded that they seemed never intended for human wear. Mr. Dodd himself was a man polished by habit. His moustache appeared ironed. "Inspector, always a pleasure. Trousers, collars, or calamities today?" "Only the last," said Purbright pleasantly. "You knew the deceased, I think?" Dodd's smile remained but tightened, like elastic under strain. "I may have seen him. One of those faces one can't place. He came in a few days ago asking directions. Wanted to know where the Public Works Office kept its keys. Said he was writing an article on heritage sites. Quite inquisitive, but harmless." "Indeed. And you warned him his journey was wasted?" A flicker of surprise crossed Dodd's face before he mastered it. "Oh, that? Idle phrase, Inspector. I meant the tower was locked. Restoration over. No more to see." Purbright regarded him with amiable patience. A sensible remark, especially if one wished the gentleman not to see too much. Dodd's protest was smooth, but his eyes had lost rhythm. "Now, look here." Purbright raised a hand. "Please don't alarm yourself. We are merely collecting observations, like your fine collection of ties. Tell me, do you recall where you were last night?" "At home, of course. My wife will confirm it." "I have no doubt she would, with feeling," said Purbright. "One last matter. The Horological Society. Are its funds sound?" Dodd drew himself up, a man affronted on behalf of bookkeeping everywhere. "Perfectly sound. Annual audit, every penny accounted for." "Splendid. Because there are those who say that time in Flaxborough is measured more in shillings than seconds." Dodd blinked, uncertain whether he was being accused or flattered. "I assure you, Inspector, we are an honourable body." "I never doubted it," Purbright said, and left before reassurance could decay into questions. Back at the station, a telephone message awaited him. It was from Dr. Hilliard. "Body examined again as requested," it read. "Under left sleeve. Faint circular bruise, half-inch diameter. Could indicate needle mark or instrument pressure. Not natural." Purbright sat very still. Then he reached for the anonymous letter once more, smoothing it beside the report. The handwriting trembled, the ink blotched at one corner where a drop had fallen, or a tear. He tapped the table gently with his pen. "Sent for," he murmured. "Not from London, after all." Love watched him. "Someone lured him here, sir. Possibly with the promise of payment or blackmail or both, and someone else ensured he left without either." Purbright rose, moving to the window. The clock tower's face, visible over the rooftops, shone dull in the afternoon haze. "We shall speak to the mayor next," he said quietly. "He knows the value of time better than most, and perhaps the price of silence." The mayor of Flaxborough, Alderman Mowbray, received Inspector Purbright in his study with the unease of a man who had been rehearsing indignation but found it unconvincing. The room smelled of pipe smoke and unspent ambition. Framed photographs of the mayor in various civic postures, opening fetes, admiring drains, shaking hands with visiting Rotarians, hung around the walls, all conveying an impression of cheerful duty being slightly out of focus. "Inspector," Mowbray began, spreading his hands as though unveiling innocence, "you've come, no doubt, about that wretched affair at the tower. Dreadful thing, simply dreadful. I was saying only this morning that it threatens to make our restoration look like a publicity stunt gone wrong." Purbright smiled faintly. "I'm sure the Clocktower would forgive the intrusion if it could. I'd like to ask a few questions, purely to clear up small details, you understand." Of course. I'm entirely at your disposal." "Good of you. Tell me, Mr. Mayor, you're a member of the Horological Society." "Indeed. Founder, in fact. It was I who persuaded the council to allocate funds for the clock's refurbishment, a matter of civic pride." "And how much was allocated?" £500, said Mowbray promptly. "Every penny accounted for." "Ah, and yet there was a shortfall, I believe. Something about an anonymous donation." The mayor's smile faltered, like a candle guttering in a draught. Yes, there was. £50, if memory serves. A local benefactor who preferred discretion. Such gestures are not unusual, Inspector. Indeed, especially when they buy silence as well as generosity. Mowbray's eyes hardened. "If that's meant as a slur on my administration?" "Not at all," said Purbright calmly. "But you see, our dead man had a note referring to subscriptions due. It seems he was pursuing a debt, or perhaps ensuring that the society's finances were, shall we say, honestly wound. Preposterous. The man was a stranger. Yet one who asked very pointed questions about funding, the draper Dodd, for instance, recalls your presence when he did." The mayor blinked, then looked away toward the window. Outside, rain streaked the panes. "Inspector, I was polite to the fellow, nothing more. He introduced himself as a Mr. Gordon. Said he was writing for some regional heritage journal. I assumed he wanted photographs for a feature. The next I knew, he was dead under my clock tower. If you're implying that I imply nothing," Purbright interrupted gently. "But perhaps you could explain why your name appears on a payment authorization for extra restoration expenses. £49, 10 shillings, made 2 days before the man's death." Mowbray froze. Then, after a moment, he gave a short, helpless laugh. "You are thorough, Inspector. The payment was for additional work by Mr. Wilkie. Adjustments to the bell mechanism. Nothing improper." "I'm sure Mr. Wilkie will confirm that," said Purbright. He rose, buttoning his coat. "In the meantime, I'd appreciate the name of your anonymous donor. Discretion will be preserved on all sides." Mowbray hesitated. "It was Mrs. Fanshawe," he said finally, with the tone of one surrendering an unimportant piece in a complicated game. "She wished the contribution kept private. Vanity of a different sort, you understand." Purbright inclined his head politely. "Thank you. I always find secrecy most enlightening." He left the mayor's house with Love in tow. The sergeant waited until they were halfway down the drive before muttering, "Sir, do you reckon he's lying?" "Reckoning, Sergeant, implies arithmetic," said Purbright. "I merely observe that Alderman Mowbray has supplied an answer before discovering the question." Love frowned. "But why Miss Fanshawe? She's got opinions, not money." "Indeed," murmured Purbright. "Perhaps her donation was moral rather than financial." At that hour, Miss Fanshawe was presiding over a tea tray in her sitting room, which bore the rigid cleanliness of someone who believed dust to be a personal insult. She greeted Purbright with the brittle civility of a woman unaccustomed to visitors who were not delivering flowers or parish notices. "Inspector, what a surprise. I trust you bring progress?" "Progress of a sort," he said mildly. "The mayor mentioned that you made a private contribution to the restoration fund." She blinked, her teacup trembling slightly on its saucer. The mayor said that? He did. Was he mistaken? I should think so. My contribution was purely administrative. I kept the records, ensured invoices matched quotations. If the mayor found that worthy of credit, it speaks to his imagination. Purbright smiled faintly. You didn't, by any chance, know the deceased? Miss Fanshawe set the cup down with more precision than grace. Know him? Certainly not. I did, however, see him. He came to my office last week, asking for access to the society's accounts. Claimed he was an auditor sent from the county council. His credentials looked perfectly proper, but something about him. She paused, frowning at the memory. He asked whether all funds had been properly acknowledged. Such a curious phrase. And did you show him the records? I told him to apply to the treasurer. That would be Councillor Cripps. He left a card, but I misplaced it. Quite unaccountable, as I am rarely careless. Quite, Purbright said softly. And you haven't mentioned this visit until now. I wasn't aware he was dead, Inspector. I heard only this morning. I assumed he had gone about his business. His business seems to have gone about him, Purbright said, rising. If you find that card, please let us know. As they stepped out into the drizzle again, Love shook his head. So he wasn't a journalist, wasn't a tourist, maybe not even Gordon. Names are like umbrellas, said Purbright. People carry them for shelter, not identification. Love sighed. We've got a mayor hiding something, a spinster with missing papers, and a draper who sweats when you mention neatness. Where do we start? Purbright's eyes drifted toward the clock tower, whose face gleamed pale and guileless above the rooftops. With the missing notebook, Sergeant. If someone removed it, they did so either to hide what was written or to ensure we found what wasn't. They walked on in silence, the steady drizzle pattering on cobbles. Behind them, the clock struck 5, a sound both punctual and accusing. Purbright listened, then murmured, Time, once again, keeps its own counsel. That evening, Flaxborough lay under a fine drizzle that blurred the lamps and lent the cobbles a faint, watery glow. The square was nearly empty, save for the occasional umbrella passing like a slow-moving beetle. From his office window, Purbright watched the clock tower loom out of the mist, its pale face blinking in and out of sight as the fog swirled. He found the effect oddly companionable, as though the tower, too, were reflecting on recent events and coming to no conclusion. On his desk lay a small collection of evidence. The anonymous letter, a copy of the society's membership list, and the police surgeon's note about the bruise beneath the dead man's sleeve. The puzzle was taking shape, but the pieces refused to declare their borders. The man's identity, the missing notebook, and the unexplained bruise, 3 threads twisting together without yet revealing what they bound. Sergeant Love came in carrying 2 cups of tea, setting one down with his customary care that looked almost reverent. No news from county records yet, sir. They're still checking auditors registered under the name Gordon. Could be tomorrow. Purbright nodded absently. Thank you, Love. Did you visit the clock tower again after tea? Yes, sir. Locked up tight. The constable on watch says no one's gone near it since yesterday morning. But I did have a word with young Billy Much, the lad who helps Mr. Wilkie polish the bell casings. Said he found something odd yesterday, just after you left the site. Odd is a good start, murmured Purbright. What was it? A pencil stub wedged in a crack behind the stairs. Billy said it looked new, sharpened recently. He pocketed it, of course, thinking it might be lucky. I've got it here. He handed over a short yellow pencil with a faint grease stain near the end. Purbright turned it over thoughtfully. A shop mark, he said, pointing to a faint embossed name along the side. Dodd's Drapery. How enterprising of Mr. Dodd to diversify into stationery. Love blinked. You think it's his? Or that someone wanted us to think so? A pencil is a humble clue, Sergeant, but humility is often where guilt hides most effectively. He set it aside and took a long sip of his tea. "We shall call on Mr. Dodd again tomorrow. I'm curious to see whether his handwriting still maintains its tidy symmetry when he's surprised." The next morning, the drizzle had hardened into a fine, sharp rain. The drapery shop smelled of damp wool and lavender sachets. Mr. Dodd was at the counter, rearranging ties into a formation of unconvincing optimism. He greeted Purbright with forced geniality that trembled on the edge of anxiety. "Inspector, back again so soon? Something I can help with?" "Merely a trifle," said Purbright, laying the pencil on the counter. "You stock these, I believe?" Dodd looked down, frowning. "Yes, I sell a few. Comes with the account books we keep for local tradesmen." "Why?" "One was found in the Clocktower. I wondered if it might have been yours." The draper's face paled slightly. "Mine? Good heavens, no. I've not been near the place since that dreadful day. You can ask anyone." "Mr. Dodd," Purbright said gently, "people in Flaxborough are so obliging that one can always find someone to confirm almost anything. What I should like is your own confirmation. Did you or did you not visit the tower after the restoration work was completed?" I may have looked in once. Wilkie was showing me how the new mechanism worked, but that was a week ago at least." "And you haven't been since?" "No." The denial came quickly, too quickly. Purbright smiled mildly. "Then someone has borrowed your pencil. You must be a generous man." He paused, letting the silence grow like ivy between them. "Tell me, Mr. Dodd, did you know that the man who died, Mr. Gordon, as he called himself, was not an auditor at all?" Dodd's eyes widened. "Not an auditor? Then who?" "That," Purbright said, "is what we are all wondering. He may have been investigating something rather more delicate than public accounts." The draper swallowed. "You don't think he was blackmailing someone?" "Do you?" For a heartbeat, Dodd seemed about to speak, then stopped himself. "I can't say, Inspector. But Flaxborough isn't London. People here don't have the kind of secrets worth blackmailing over." Purbright regarded him with quiet amusement. "Ah, but small secrets, Mr. Dodd, are often more valuable than large ones. They're cheaper to buy and easier to hide." He picked up the pencil, returning it to his pocket. "If you think of anything further, however trivial, please send word." When they stepped back into the rain, Love said, "He's frightened, sir, like a rabbit pretending to be a teapot." "Very apt, Sergeant, and rabbits rarely hide without a reason. We'll leave him to simmer." They walked in silence for a time. The tower chimed noon as they passed the square, and Purbright's gaze lifted briefly to its pale dial. "Let's see what Mr. Cripps can tell us about missing notebooks," he said at last. The councillor's office in the Public Works building smelled of damp files and boiled linseed oil. Cripps looked even more rumpled than usual, his expression hovering between weariness and resentment. "You again, Inspector. I told you everything about those keys." "Yes," said Purbright, "but not, I think, about your accounts. Miss Fanshawe tells me an auditor approached you last week asking to inspect the Society's books." Cripps blinked, then nodded reluctantly. "That's right. Odd fellow. Said he wanted to verify some expenditure on the restoration. I told him everything was signed off by the mayor. He made notes, lots of them. I haven't seen him since." "You didn't ask who sent him?" "I assumed it was a county hall business. He had proper papers." Purbright nodded slowly. "And when he left?" "Walked toward the square. I thought no more of it." The inspector regarded him for a moment. "And you have no idea what became of his notes?" Cripps shook his head. "Not a clue." Purbright smiled faintly. "I suspect you're right, Councillor. You've never been much for clues." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "By the way, if you should come across any unusual correspondence or contributions to civic funds, do remember that secrecy, however well meant, tends to chime at inconvenient hours." Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist. The clock struck again, 3 deliberate, echoing notes. Purbright listened, thoughtful. Somewhere beneath that calm rhythm lay deceit ticking like a watch buried under stone. By late afternoon, the air over Flaxborough had cleared into a pale stillness. The market stalls were packed away, the square rinsed clean by the rain, leaving behind only the smell of damp stone and faint yeast from Pratt's bakery. Inspector Purbright stood for a moment beneath the clock tower, gazing up at its repaired face. The hands ticked with serene indifference, the newly gilded numerals gleaming as though scandal and death were matters for lesser mechanisms. He turned as footsteps approached. Sergeant Love appeared, slightly out of breath and holding a small brown envelope. "From county records, sir. They found something about that auditor name, Gordon." Purbright took the envelope, slit it open, and withdrew a single typed sheet. The information was sparse but sufficient. "No registered auditor by that name in the county," he read aloud, "nor in adjacent districts. However, there was a freelance accountant named Arthur Gordon, dismissed from a firm in Lincoln 2 years ago for irregularities in client accounts." Love frowned. "Gordon, sir. Sounds close enough to Gordon." "Close enough for a man wishing to be believed," Purbright murmured. "Small alteration can lend a large respectability. So our visitor was a dismissed accountant, perhaps not on official business, but certainly equipped to sniff out unbalanced books." He folded the page thoughtfully. "Which raises the question, whose books drew his attention? Cripps, maybe, or the societies. Possibly, or perhaps something more personal. Money in Flaxborough has a remarkable way of adhering to reputation before escaping entirely." He set off across the square, Love matching his stride. Their destination was Miss Fanshaw's house once more. Purbright had been turning over in his mind the way she'd hesitated when speaking of the stranger, her precision faltering, her hand trembling ever so slightly when she mentioned the lost card. He suspected that in Flaxborough, as elsewhere, trembling hands were seldom purely emotional. Miss Fanshawe answered the door in her usual severe attire, though her composure seemed strained at the edges. "Inspector Purbright." "Again?" "Merely following a missing item, Miss Fanshawe. You mentioned a card the stranger left. Any success locating it?" She pursed her lips. "No, Inspector. I've searched everywhere. I can only suppose it was discarded by accident." Purbright regarded her evenly. "That would be unfortunate, since it might have confirmed his identity. He was not, it seems, an auditor after all." Her expression froze. "Not an auditor?" "No, a former accountant, dismissed for misconduct." There was a flicker of something, relief perhaps, or alarm, quickly smothered. "Then his inquiries were fraudulent," she said sharply. "The man must have been a swindler. I told him nothing, you know. Nothing of value." Purbright inclined his head. "No doubt, though I wonder if he might have learned something of value from someone else." He paused, his gaze drifting toward a small desk near the window. "You keep meticulous files, Miss Fanshawe. Would you mind if I glanced at the Society's correspondence folder? I'd like to confirm the authenticity of a few signatures." For a moment, she hesitated. Then, with a curt motion, she crossed to the desk and withdrew a neat brown file. "There you are, Inspector. All correspondence, receipts, minutes of meetings. Nothing secret about them." He thanked her and leafed through the papers slowly. Each page bore her careful typing, her precise annotations. Then, near the bottom, a letter stood out. A request for payment to a Mr. Wilkie for unforeseen mechanical adjustments, signed by Cripps and countersigned by Mowbray. Purbright held it up. "May I keep this copy?" "If you think it relevant," she said coolly. "I think it may clarify who profited by unforeseen events," Purbright replied, slipping it into his pocket. Back outside, the evening light was fading, the lamps beginning to blink awake along the street. Love asked, "You think she's lying, sir?" Not lying, Sergeant. Curating. Miss Fanshawe arranges truth the way florists arrange artificial roses, neat, symmetrical, and entirely without fragrance. They crossed the road to the narrow lane where Wilkie's workshop glowed faintly through the windows. Inside, the clockmaker looked up from his bench, his magnifying lens dangling from its strap. "Inspector, I was just thinking of you. I've been rechecking the tower mechanism. Something curious." "Do tell," said Purbright. Wilkie wiped his hands on a rag. The bell hammer, new pin fitted during restoration, wasn't quite aligned. Someone must have tampered with it after my final adjustment. Only slightly, mind, but enough that the striker could jam if released too quickly. Purbright's brows rose. Could such a thing cause harm? Only if someone were beneath the bell when it freed itself. The hammer weighs near 50 pounds. The inspector nodded slowly. And was anyone aware of this possibility? Not that I told. Except Cripps, of course. He signed off on the final inspection. Love glanced at Purbright uneasily. "Sir, you don't think—" "I think," Purbright interrupted, "that Mr. Godden, our late visitor, may have been more inquisitive than cautious. He might have gone up to the tower to verify some entry, or perhaps to meet someone who preferred privacy." He looked at Wilkie. "Tell me, Mr. Wilkie, how long would it take to climb from the base to the bell chamber?" 4 minutes, maybe 5 if you pause for breath. "And once there, could a man fall by accident?" "Unlikely," Wilkie said. "The platform's secure, unless one were pushed or fainted." "Or injected," murmured Purbright. Wilkie blinked. "Injected?" "Merely conjecture," the inspector said lightly. "But it seems our man bore a small bruise, circular, 1/2 inch across, a mark sometimes left by a hypodermic needle." The clockmaker's mouth opened slightly, then shut again. "Good Lord." "Indeed. Do you by any chance possess such instruments?" "Needles? Only for oiling, Inspector. Not for anything living." Purbright gave a mild nod. "Then you're safe from suspicion, at least for tonight. Thank you for your time." Outside, as they walked back toward the square, Love said, "So he was poisoned, sir. Perhaps stunned, perhaps worse. Whatever the substance, it served its purpose." Silence. They paused at the tower steps. The light from a nearby lamp fell across the door's worn stone threshold, and Purbright's gaze lingered there, tracing faint marks the rain had failed to wash away. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "tomorrow we shall visit Dr. Hilliard once more. I'd like him to check that bruise again and test for anything that does not belong in a Flaxborough corpse." Love shifted uneasily. "Do you think you know who did it, sir?" Purbright's eyes rose to the face of the clock, calm and pale against the gathering dark. "Not yet," he said, "but I know who wound the spring." The next morning brought a brittle sunlight that sharpened every outline in Flaxborough, giving the town an almost self-conscious air of tidiness, as though anxious to appear respectable after the night's dreams. Inspector Purbright, who had little faith in such illusions, arrived at the police station early. On his desk lay Dr. Hilliard's report, freshly delivered by hand. The doctor, in his neat and joyless handwriting, had provided confirmation. Traces of a sedative compound were present in the deceased's bloodstream, mild enough to dull consciousness, strong enough to prevent movement or speech. Purbright read the words twice before folding the page. "So," he murmured, "our Mr. Godden was put to sleep before he died. A considerate killer." Sergeant Love, hovering nearby, asked, "Any sign what the drug was, sir?" "Something akin to chlorotone, Hilliard says. Once fashionable for calming nerves. Sold over the counter until people realized it also calmed witnesses." He rose, pocketing the report. "Let's see who in Flaxborough still finds use for such a commodity." Their first stop was Pratt's chemist. The shop was quiet, its air faintly perfumed with antiseptic virtue. Mr. Pratt appeared from behind a display of liniments, rubbing his hands in a way that suggested both hygiene and anticipation. "Inspector, to what do I owe the pleasure this time? More inquiries of a medicinal nature?" "Only in the broadest sense," said Purbright. "We're tracing recent purchases of chlortone, or any sedative resembling it. Would your records show such sales?" Pratt's eyebrows rose. "Chlortone, you say? Not much call for it these days. A few older customers still swear by it for sleeplessness. Let me see." He consulted a ledger with the solemnity of a priest examining sins. "Last week? Yes, a small bottle sold on Tuesday. Charged to account. Councillor Cripps." Love blinked. "Cripps, sir?" Purbright nodded slowly. "Indeed. And when did you last see him, Mr. Pratt?" "Why, not since he collected the bottle. Said it was for cleaning clock parts. Claims it cuts grease, which I dare say is true if one's patient enough. I remember thinking it rather a costly solvent." "Thank you," Purbright said. "You've been most illuminating as ever." Outside, Love looked both pleased and nervous. "That's it then, sir. Cripps must have drugged the fellow, carried him to the tower." Purbright raised a hand. "If Cripps were half as efficient as your imagination, Sergeant, Flaxborough's drains would flow like the Thames. Let's speak to him before we pronounce." They found Cripps not at his office, but at the Crown Tea Rooms, where he sat glumly before a cup of weak tea and a bun that looked resentful of attention. His face, usually flushed with administrative importance, was pale. "Inspector," he said without conviction, "I was just reading the paper. They're calling it the Clocktower tragedy now. Sounds like something out of a penny novel." Purbright smiled faintly. "Indeed. And the plot thickens, though perhaps you can help to clarify it. You recently purchased a bottle of chlortone." Cripps blinked, then coloured. "Good Lord, that. Yes, I did. Wilkie recommended it for cleaning brass pivots. Perfectly innocent. Yet you didn't mention it before." "Why should I? You asked about keys and accounts, not cleaning fluids." "True," said Purbright, his tone mild. "But our dead visitor had that very substance in his system, enough to prevent him from standing unaided, let alone climbing stairs." Cripps' mouth worked, producing a sound that was almost laughter. "You can't think I— Good heavens, Inspector, I'm a counsellor, not a poisoner." "Flaxborough has never required its officers to be mutually exclusive," Purbright said gently. "Tell me, when did you last see the man?" "I've told you. He came to my office, asked questions, took notes. That was all." "And afterwards?" "Afterwards, I went home. My wife was visiting her sister, so I dined alone." He hesitated, then added lamely, "You can ask the milkman. I spoke to him about his bill." Purbright regarded him for a moment longer, then said, "You'll forgive me if I verify your industry with Mr. Pratt." He stood. "Good day, Councillor." Outside, Love exhaled. "He's lying through his dentures, sir." "Perhaps. But lies, like timepieces, need winding. We must see who benefits from keeping him ticking." They returned to the station, where a message awaited them, hand-delivered again, unsigned, in the same shaky hand as before. He wasn't meant to die. The man only came to frighten them. The money changed hands already. Purbright studied the letter for a long moment. "So," he murmured, "there was payment after all." "Blackmail, sir." "Or a settlement," he said softly. "Someone paid to prevent exposure. Gordon came to collect, but his client preferred a more permanent form of receipt." He glanced out of the window, where dusk was settling once more over the square. The clock tower stood serene, yet its shadow reached far. "Come, Love, we'll visit the mayor again. Men who play at generosity often forget where they put the purse." The mayor received them with even less confidence than before. His chain of office was absent, and his eyes had the dull gleam of a man rehearsing innocence. "Inspector," he began, "if this is about those rumors in the Citizen, I assure you—" Rumours have the good manners to wait for truth, said Purbright. We've learned your society's auditor was not official. He was dismissed for dishonesty, yet you received him politely. Why? Mowbray's mouth tightened. He claimed to have information about irregularities in our restoration grant. Threatened to go to the press unless I paid him to keep silent. I refused. Yet someone paid him, Purbright said evenly. We have evidence of that. Who? I've no idea, the mayor said, though his voice was a shade too firm. Ask Cripps. He handled the accounts. Purbright smiled slightly. Cripps purchased Clocktower for cleaning. A flicker of panic crossed the mayor's face. What? That fool! He said he'd deal with the man quietly, just talk to him. Purbright nodded. And so he did. Quite quietly. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of a small carriage clock on the mantelpiece, measured and unhurried. Purbright's gaze rested on it, then returned to the mayor. Time, Mr. Mowbray, has a most inconvenient habit of keeping perfect memory. He rose, signaling to Love. Fetch Cripps, Sergeant. He may wish to adjust his statement before the next chime. Cripps was brought to the station at 8:30 that evening, his collar damp from the drizzle and his expression fixed somewhere between resentment and panic. He had been fetched from his house, where, according to his housekeeper, he'd been sitting quiet with his head in his hands since tea time. Now, under the harsh office lamp, he looked smaller than his usual civic self. His habitual bluster collapsed into uncertainty. Purbright allowed him a moment to compose himself, offering neither accusation nor comfort. Sit down, councillor. Tea? Cripps hesitated, then shook his head. I suppose you'll want me to make a statement. In your own words, if possible, Purbright said, mildly. Though economy and accuracy are always welcome companions. The councillor's gaze dropped to the floor. The mayor's told you, I expect, he muttered. About the man, Godden, or whatever his name was. Came to the office last week, said he'd been going over the figures for the restoration grant. Claimed something didn't add up. And did it? Cripps hesitated again. Not exactly. The mayor, he'd used part of the grant money for another civic project unofficially. Just a temporary adjustment, he said. But this fellow had the receipts. Said he could make it look like embezzlement unless we made it worth his while to forget. So you paid him? Cripps's eyes flicked up, alarmed. Not me. The mayor gave him a check, £50, I think. Said it was better than a scandal. That was the end of it, or so I thought. Until he came back, Purbright said quietly. Cripps swallowed. Yes, 2 days later. Said he'd found another discrepancy. I told him the mayor wouldn't pay again. He laughed. Said maybe someone else would. Someone who'd signed the authorization forms. And you had? Yes. Cripps' hands twisted in his lap. I panicked, Inspector. He was threatening to ruin me. Said he'd go to the papers, to the council auditors. I couldn't afford that. Not after 30 years in public service. I went to see him that evening. Just to talk. Where? At the tower. He'd taken the key from Wilkie. Said it was a good place to discuss things privately. I found him there, already half drunk, waving his notes about. I tried to reason with him, told him we could put things right quietly, but he laughed again. Called me a coward. Said I hadn't the nerve to stand up to the mayor. Purbright waited. And then? I don't remember much after that, Cripps said hoarsely. He started shouting. I must have shoved him. He stumbled, hit the wall, I think. I swear I didn't mean to hurt him. Then he just slumped down, breathing oddly. I thought he'd fainted. I didn't know about the drug. I swear it, Inspector. Purbright regarded him with quiet patience. You didn't know, but you had it in your possession. Cripps's face crumpled. I'd been drinking myself that night. I'd used a few drops of that Clocktower in my tea earlier. It helps me sleep. Maybe I offered him some. I don't remember. He said he had a headache. I might have given him the cup. God help me, I can't be sure. Silence filled the room, heavy and deliberate. Love shifted uneasily by the door. Purbright leaned back in his chair. You left him there? I thought he'd come round, Cripps whispered. Next morning, when I heard he'd been found dead, I nearly went mad. I didn't tell the mayor. I didn't tell anyone. I knew no one would believe me. People seldom do, Purbright said quietly, especially when disbelief is more convenient. He stood and crossed to the window, where the night pressed against the glass. You understand, Councillor, that your story leaves the precise cause of death rather uncertain. Cripps nodded miserably. I didn't kill him, Inspector. I just didn't help him. Purbright turned, his face unreadable. A distinction that sometimes only the clergy appreciate. You'll stay here tonight, for your own safety as much as ours. We'll talk again in the morning. When Cripps had been led away, Love exhaled in relief. Well, that's that, isn't it? He's confessed one way or another. Purbright shook his head. He's confessed to fear, not to murder. There's a difference. And something about his story doesn't tick in time. If Garden was drugged before he reached the tower, Cripps' clumsy remorse doesn't fit the rhythm. Love frowned. Then who? The one who wound the clock, Sergeant, Purbright said softly. Or perhaps the one who paid for it. The following morning brought fresh confirmation from Dr. Hilliard. The drug had been ingested at least an hour before death. That meant it had been administered before the meeting at the tower. Purbright read the note twice, then reached for his coat. We'll pay another call on the mayor, he said. They found Alderman Mowbray at home again, this time in dressing gown and slippers, his manner one of exhausted outrage. I heard about poor Cripps, he said as they entered. He's not well, you know, always was too soft for politics. Purbright glanced around the room. On a sideboard sat a half-empty bottle of brandy and a glass. He says you paid Godden to keep quiet. Mowbray stiffened. Nonsense. I offered him a loan to tide him over, nothing more. The man was desperate. And he came back for more. So I'm told, but I never saw him again. Ask anyone. You'll find I was at home all that evening. Indeed, Purbright said evenly. And how many people share your fondness for Clocktower? The mayor froze. What are you implying? That you were kind enough to supply Cripps with his cleaning solution. The same bottle that found its way into Godden's tea. Mowbray's face whitened. You can't prove that. Proof is often overrated, Purbright said mildly. But pattern, Mr. Mayor. Pattern never lies. You authorized a payment that shouldn't exist. You entertained a man who knew too much, and you possess both the motive and the means to ensure he stayed quiet. For a moment, Mowbray looked ready to protest. Then something in him sagged. He wasn't supposed to die, he muttered. I just wanted him to stop. Purbright nodded once, almost kindly. That's usually how it begins. He glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece. It was 2 minutes slow. You'll forgive me for saying so, Mr. Mayor, but you might have kept better time. Mowbray's shoulders seemed to cave inward, the pompous bulk of civic pride shrinking to something smaller, older, and quietly frightened. His fingers traced the edge of the brandy glass, turning it without purpose. He'd written to me, he said after a moment, his voice low. Said he'd found discrepancies, wanted another meeting. I'd already paid him once, but he wouldn't stop. He hinted he had someone else's confidence, someone on the council. I couldn't risk it becoming public. Not with the election coming. Purbright remained silent, watching. The mayor's words spilled out in fits, as if coaxed by the ticking of the mantel clock. So I sent for him again. We met at my office after hours, 2 nights before his death. I offered him a drink just to calm things down. I put a little of the Clocktower in it. Cripps had told me it was harmless, a sedative. I thought if he were less volatile, it would make negotiation easier. But you misjudged the dose, Purbright said softly. Mowbray's eyes lifted, dull and resentful. I gave him what I thought was a spoonful. He drank it, smiled oddly, and said he'd take a walk before deciding. That was the last I saw of him. I never expected—" He stopped, unable or unwilling to finish. Purbright regarded him steadily. "And yet you said nothing when the body was found." What could I say? I didn't even know how he'd died. When I heard it was at the Clocktower, well, it seemed impossible. I told myself it was coincidence. "Coincidence," Purbright repeated. "A drugged man dying in a monument you funded after blackmailing you for the same money. You must have a remarkable faith in chance, Mr. Mayor." Mowbray's lips quivered and he muttered something like a prayer. "I didn't mean it. You have to believe that." "I believe you meant to protect yourself," said Purbright, "and that you succeeded rather too efficiently." He signaled to Love, who stepped forward quietly. "Sergeant, would you be kind enough to arrange for the mayor to be driven to the station? He'll be more comfortable there than in his conscience." As Love escorted the man from the room, Purbright lingered by the fireplace, glancing once more at the mantel clock. 2 minutes slow still, stubbornly unwilling to keep proper pace. "You really ought to have had Wilkie look at you," he murmured to it before turning to follow. At the station, Mowbray's statement was taken formally, stumbling, halting, and intermittently self-justifying. He admitted to the meeting, the doctored drink, and his decision to remain silent afterward. But one detail continued to trouble Purbright. "You say," he pressed, "that Godden left your office under his own power?" "Yes," Mowbray said. He walked out, a bit unsteady, but still on his feet. "I swear it." "Then he couldn't have reached the tower alone," Purbright said. "That's half a mile of cobbled streets, and the drug would have slowed him to a crawl within minutes. Someone helped him, or fetched him there." The mayor shook his head weakly. "I don't know who. I didn't send anyone." "Perhaps not intentionally," Purbright murmured. "But messages travel in small towns, Mr. Mayor, even those you don't mean to send." When the mayor was taken away to the holding cell, Purbright remained in the dim office. He filled his pipe but didn't light it, staring instead at the evidence laid out neatly before him. The anonymous letters, the society's papers, the half-empty bottle from Cripps's house. The pieces fit, and yet there was a slight asymmetry that nagged him. It was the same irritation one feels when a clock ticks with perfect rhythm but still keeps the wrong time. He turned over the first anonymous note again. He was sent for. Not blackmailed, not summoned, but sent for. Someone had drawn the man to Flaxborough, not merely reacted to his presence. Love appeared at the door. "Everything's signed, sir. Mowbray's in the cell. Cripps has been told." Poor devil broke down crying. Purbright nodded absently. "And Miss Fanshawe?" "Home, I suppose. Still says she's got no card from the man." "Then she's lying," Purbright said quietly. "Fetch your coat, Sergeant. We'll disturb her orderliness one last time." They walked through the still streets, the night air smelling faintly of wet stone and coal smoke. Miss Fanshawe's house stood in prim defiance of the hour, its curtains drawn, its front path swept clean as a conscience. Purbright knocked once, politely. There was a pause, then the door opened a cautious inch. "Inspector," she said, her tone brittle. "Is this entirely necessary? It's after 10. "Regrettably, Miss Fanshawe, murder has little respect for visiting hours." Her lips tightened. "You've already accused enough of us. Must I be next?" Purbright regarded her mildly. "I don't accuse, Miss Fanshawe. I merely inquire, and I wonder why a man who was sent for might have chosen to visit you first." The faintest flicker passed through her eyes. "I've no idea what you mean." "You wrote to him," Purbright said, his voice soft, almost conversational. "The letters were yours. The careful phrasing, the ink, the typeface of that old Underwood you keep in your office. You invited him to examine the society's accounts, hinting that he might discover something worth his while. You knew he'd take the bait. You meant to expose the mayor's misuse of funds, but not to kill anyone." Her hand trembled on the door frame. "I only wanted the truth known," she whispered. "The town's money, our money, was being used for favors, dinners, votes. I'd seen the receipts. But I couldn't go to the papers myself. They'd laugh at me, call it spite." "So you sent for a man with a reputation for making trouble," said Purbright gently. "And you lost control of the outcome." Tears glistened unshed in her eyes. "He promised he'd handle it quietly. Said all he wanted was enough to leave town. I didn't know he'd go to the mayor directly. I didn't know any of this would happen." Purbright sighed, his expression softening. "No, Miss Fanshawe. People seldom know the consequences of their little rearrangements of truth. They just wind the mechanism and let time do the striking." She drew herself up, the tears vanishing behind a wall of dignity. "What will happen to me?" "Nothing criminal," Purbright said. "Your letters will stay between us. You've done enough damage already. Though I dare say the Horological Society will require a new secretary." Her mouth twisted in something between shame and gratitude. "You're a kind man, Inspector." "Only punctual," he replied. "I dislike loose ends." As they left, Love murmured, "So it started with her, sir?" "Yes," Purbright said, "and it ends with her too, in a way. She wound the first spring. The mayor turned the second. Cripps panicked and made sure the mechanism kept moving, and the clock tower, poor innocent structure, merely chimed the hour as usual." The tower loomed into view as they turned back onto the square, its face pale against the night. Somewhere inside, gears clicked softly in patient motion, keeping time for a town that had, for once, run a little too fast. The following morning, a thin frost glazed the square, softening even the clock tower's edges. The cold lent Flaxborough a deceptive tranquility. The sort that comes after gossip has spent itself and before remorse begins to settle in. From his office window, Inspector Purbright watched the breath of the town rise and vanish, as though it were exhaling secrets it had no further use for. On his desk lay the last of the reports. Typed, signed, and, as far as the paperwork was concerned, conclusive. The mayor's confession, Cripps's statement, the chemist's ledger, and Dr. Hilliard's final coroner's note all pointed to one grim, tidy conclusion: accidental death by an overdose of chlorotone administered in good intention and withheld confession. Yet Purbright's expression betrayed no satisfaction. His cases, he often reflected, never ended so much as settled uneasily into the folds of local memory, where truth and convenience could live in wary proximity. Sergeant Love arrived carrying the Morning Citizen, whose headline blared, "Clock Tower Case Solved, Civic Misfortune or Moral Collapse." He placed it on the desk with cautious reverence. "They've made quite a meal of it, sir. Got your name in there, too." "Ah," Purbright murmured, glancing at the column. Inspector Purbright declined to comment, but was understood to be gratified by the outcome. He folded the paper neatly. "How remarkable. I was not aware of being understood at all." Love grinned uncertainly, then sobered. "They're saying Mowbray might stand down before the inquiry. The council's holding an emergency session tonight." "Indeed. Then perhaps they'll finally repair something of value." Purbright rose, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. "But before they tidy up their morals, we'd better make one final visit, to Dr. Hilliard. I'd like to confirm whether the dosage that killed our visitor could have been guessed by an amateur." Hilliard received them in his surgery, a small chamber perpetually scented of disinfectant and resignation. He was hunched over a microscope when they entered, his thin hair illuminated like a halo by the winter light. "Inspector," he said without looking up, "you've come for the epitaph, no doubt. I've written enough of them lately." "Only for clarification," said Purbright. "You reported the concentration of chlorotone as consistent with roughly a tablespoonful?" "Give or take," said the doctor. "Twice that would have been fatal within the hour. Half that, merely soporific. A teaspoon might dull the mind, but not the conscience. So a man without medical knowledge could easily misjudge the amount. Easily, Hilliard said, straightening. Especially if pouring from one of those wretched glass droppers. Half a dozen people in town have asked me for them in recent years. Even Miss Fanshawe, come to think of it, claims it keeps her nerves calm before committee meetings. Purbright's brow lifted slightly. Miss Fanshawe? Yes, though I doubt she'd misuse it. She measures everything, even indignation. Back outside, Love looked puzzled. What do you make of that, sir? You don't think she— No, Sergeant. Miss Fanshawe may wound reputations, but she'd never smudge her own fingerprints doing it. Still, her purchase gives us a clearer picture of how readily the stuff circulated. Half the town could have slipped that man a dose without realizing its danger. They paused in the square as the church clock chimed 11. The sound rolled through the air, deep and deliberate. Purbright watched the tower a long while, his gaze soft but intent, as if the chime itself contained an answer he had nearly overlooked. When he spoke again, his tone was thoughtful. It began with pride. Hers in wanting to be right, then greed, his in wanting payment, then fear, theirs in wanting silence. The mechanism was simple, the winding human. Love scuffed his boot on the cobbles. And now? Now, said Purbright, we let time run on. It's better at sentencing than we are. The rest of the day passed in a subdued rhythm. The mayor's resignation was announced at noon. Cripps, in tears, offered to repay the entire sum to the council fund. Miss Fanshawe, through a brief letter to the citizen, resigned from her secretarial post on grounds of health and civic disillusionment. Only Mr. Wilkie, when called in to examine the tower mechanism one last time, seemed untouched by moral fatigue. All running smooth now, Inspector, he reported cheerfully. Bells striking true again. Quite the symbol, eh? Purbright allowed himself a small smile. Indeed, Mr. Wilkie. A town that strikes on the hour may yet believe itself punctual in virtue. That evening, as darkness crept in, the inspector sat alone at his desk, writing the final summary for county headquarters. His prose, neat and deliberate, carried none of the color of the events it recorded. Deceased identified as Arthur Gordon, late of Lincoln. Death due to accidental overdose administered by Alderman Mowbray in an attempt to calm victim during altercation regarding misappropriation of civic funds. No evidence of premeditation. Contributing factors: moral cowardice and human frailty. He paused, tapping the pen against the blotter, then added one final sentence. Flaxborough remains a town of small deceits and large respectabilities, both curiously well-timed. He set the pen aside and leaned back, listening to the muffled quiet beyond the window. Somewhere, the clock tower began to strike 8. Slow, deliberate, implacable. Between each note, the silence seemed almost to breathe. Love appeared at the door. "You'll be turning in soon, sir." "In a while," said Purbright. "I'd like to finish my report while the town still remembers it happened." Love nodded, hesitating. "It's strange, though, isn't it? How nobody really meant to do anything terrible, but someone still ended up dead." Purbright gave a faint, tired smile. "That's the oldest story in Flaxborough, Sergeant. Intentions are the town's chief export." When Love had gone, Purbright crossed to the window. The square below was empty, the tower rising like a sentinel over the dark. Its face glowed pale and faintly smug, as though aware of its role in recent drama. The inspector watched it for a long moment, then drew the curtain closed. He extinguished the lamp, leaving only the faint ticking of the clock on his desk. Steady, self-assured, and utterly indifferent. "Well," he murmured, "let's hope the next scandal keeps better time." The clock struck once more outside, echoing softly into the stillness, and Purbright, with the patience of a man who had long since learned the rhythm of human folly, resumed his paperwork. The following morning dawned pale and windless, the kind of day Flaxborough wore like a pressed suit, tidy, expressionless, and faintly self-satisfied. The scandal had already begun its descent into anecdote. The citizens' presses thundered out a more forgiving narrative. The mayor's resignation had been quietly accepted, pending health considerations, and Miss Fanshaw's withdrawal from public life was being discussed in the haberdashery with tones of both pity and relief. Only Purbright, as was his custom, regarded the town's return to normalcy with suspicion. For Flaxborough's version of peace was usually an untidy compromise between gossip and forgetting. He sat in his office, the morning's correspondence stacked neatly to one side, the last report signed and sealed. Sergeant Love entered with 2 cups of tea and an expression of cautious cheer. "All quiet, sir," he said. "Cripps has gone to stay with his sister at Whitby. Says he needs sea air and moral cleansing. Dr. Hilliard's cleared the formal cause of death. The inquest will be tidy." Purbright stirred his tea absently. "Ah, tidy. That most seductive of adjectives. It implies completion while concealing incompleteness." Love frowned slightly. "You still think there's something missing?" "Not missing, Sergeant. Merely out of alignment." He leaned back, eyes half closed. A clock may strike the right number of times, yet still ring a second too early. Love waited, used to these measured silences. Purbright's thoughts, like the mechanisms he admired, took their time before declaring their purpose. "Tell me," the inspector said at last, "do you recall the mayor's claim that Godden left his office unassisted?" "Yes, sir. Walked out under his own power, you said." "Indeed. And yet Hilliard's report showed the concentration of chlortone in his system would have impaired movement within 10 minutes. He could not have reached the Clocktower unaided." "Then someone fetched him thereafter," said Love slowly. "Precisely. And our good mayor, as we've learned, lacked both opportunity and nerve. Cripps was drunk and terrified. Miss Fanshawe had motive but not the constitution for nocturnal transport. Which leaves us one overlooked name. Mr. Wilkie." Love blinked. "The clockmaker." "The very one. The only man with habitual access to the tower, a key to its door, and the discretion of one accustomed to working unseen. I've been wondering, Sergeant, why a man so devoted to the purity of timekeeping would insert himself so helpfully into every stage of this business. He was there when the body was found, conveniently aware of mechanical tampering, and rather too anxious to affirm his own innocence before anyone had accused him." Love's eyes widened. "But why would he kill him?" Purbright smiled faintly. "The same reason most people do in Flaxborough, not from hate, but from tidiness. You see, Wilkie knew about the mayor's misuse of funds. He'd been paid privately for repairs never entered in the books. When Godden appeared asking questions, Wilkie realized exposure would undo both his respectability and his workshop's contracts. So when the mayor, fumbling with sedatives, sent the man away half-conscious, Wilkie, ever the craftsman, completed the work neatly. He fetched the unsteady auditor to the tower, intending to keep him quiet until morning. But the dosage proved fatal, and Wilkie found himself with a corpse and an inconvenient set of accounts. Love gave a low whistle. So he made it look like an accident. Just so. He laid the body inside the tower, pocketed the notebook, and left that horological society notice beside him. A little irony, perhaps, or a substitute for a calling card. Then he locked up, polished the brass plaque next morning, and waited to be discovered as the diligent custodian of the town's punctuality. For a moment, only the ticking of the office clock filled the room. Then Love said softly, "You've already spoken to him, haven't you?" Purbright's smile deepened. "Last night. He came by to ensure the tower mechanism had suffered no moral deterioration, as he put it. I mentioned Hilliard's report and the missing notebook." His hands began to tremble, which, for a clockmaker, is practically an obituary. He'll be delivering a full confession to us shortly. He preferred that to being fetched. Love nodded, half in admiration, half in relief. That's it, then. Purbright regarded his tea, now cold. Yes, the case will close itself, like a clock winding down. The mayor's disgrace will mellow into sympathy. Cripps will rediscover his appetite, and Miss Fanshawe will devote herself to the moral uplift of window boxes. And Wilkie, well, he will be remembered as the man who kept Flaxborough's time perfectly, right until the moment he stopped it. Love smiled faintly. Funny thing, sir. The way they all thought they were just putting something right, hiding a little wrong to preserve the greater good. That, Purbright said, rising, is the essence of civic virtue. One must always be seen mending the clock, never admitting one broke it. He moved to the window, drawing the curtain aside. The tower rose above the rooftops, calm and self-assured, its great hands marking the hour with bureaucratic precision. The sound of its chime reached them a moment later, clear, deliberate, faintly smug. Purbright listened, head tilted slightly. There it is again, Sergeant. Time announcing itself without irony. A pity men cannot manage the same. Love, watching him, said quietly, "You ever get tired of it, sir? Seeing what's underneath?" Purbright smiled. "No, Sergeant. What's underneath never changes. Only the decoration does. And besides," he added, reaching for his coat, "Flaxborough would be intolerable if it weren't so endlessly human." He extinguished the desk lamp, leaving the room to the faint glow from the square. As he stepped outside, the cold caught at his breath, the air sharp and faintly metallic. The town lay hushed, the clock tower watching over it like an old and knowing witness. Somewhere, a bell struck the quarter hour, precise, polite, and profoundly indifferent. Purbright turned his collar against the wind and began the slow walk home, his footsteps echoing softly along the cobbles. The tower chimed once more, and the sound lingered, deep and measured, over the sleeping town.